Emil, like the the one who's going to solve the hunger crisis. Emil Guillermo. Emil, Amok to you. Welcome to this our program, our micro talk show. It is a micro talk show because look, I got talk show transition points. I have a sidekick. He just sits there and laughs. He gongs on the inside. And we're here for you. We're here Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Pacific live. Oh, but you say, Emil, you're on at 150. Well, that's because this is the little something extra. This is the La Nyap, where I talk about the things that we've done and some updates on past shows and whatnot. So on this show, we're going to talk about the LA riots today. We're going to talk about the LA riots today because it's 30 years after the LA riots. And, I still don't know if people really have the full impact of what happened. At least, people might remember Rodney King, but are they forgetting that there was the Rodney King and then there was the shooting at the Korean American a liquor store, and then how did the Asian Americans get involved in it? And I'm going to read from a column from LA Times columnist Frank Xiong today, which was very, kind of puts it in perspective 30 years after. We'll get to that when we move in past the 2 p.m. Pacific hour. I do want to mention how also Professor Daniel Phil Gonzalez will be here. Of course, he'll be here. He says he's going to be here. He will be here. In the meantime, we use this Yop section just to talk about some things about what we did this week. World Lapu Lapu Day was April 27th. Just want to remind you, there's still time to thwart your colonial, what do you want to call it? Is it your colonial issue, your problem, the one person that is causing you to have these colonial flashbacks? On World Lapu, on my pronouncement of World Lapu Lapu Day. It is a working holiday in the Philippines. Lapu Lapu was the Filipino leader in the island of Mactan in the Visayas. He stood up to Magellan, slayed Magellan, April 27th, 1521. Filipinos worldwide remember it as a staving off of the colonizer by about 40 years. Magellan was killed. And then Legazpi comes 40 years later, and then the Philippines is colonized by Spain. But that image of Lapu Lapu, there's still time for you to personally exercise your colonial demons. A friend of mine, Dylan Delvo, used the phrase, the most decolonized person I know. And he used that to describe the late Dawn Mabalan at her eulogy. And when he said that, I never forgot that. And I keep going back to that because isn't that a way to describe colonial mentality that sometimes still afflicts us as Filipinos, as people of color, who find ourselves sometimes in this, we're here, but we aren't worth it. We don't belong. Somehow there's that feeling. And you only get that feeling when you break free of that colonial mentality. And sometimes that hangover, that colonial hangover, is still there. How do you do it? How do you get through it? Some people say meditation. Check the end of the show. At the end of every show, I do a little meditation to help us break through. But World Lapu Lapu Day it's for real. I mean, in my mind, it's a Philippine holiday, but no reason why people who are afflicted by colonizers or people coming in wanting to suppress or oppress. World Lapu Lapu Day is your time to thwart that, to stand up, and to be uniquely you, inside and out. Not just the ethnic you, but you, inside and out. Free of those colonial bonds. Lapu Lapu did it April 27th, 1521. And so it's worth recalling, maybe making a week out of it from the 27th through 5-7 days into May. It's worth it, I think. I think it's worth it. All right, just to show you how eclectic this show can be, I also want to mention that it's Willie Nelson's birthday. You got to love the rebel, right? The cosmic cowboy, outlaw, country outlaw, right? Willie and Waylon. And this is true. I dropped out of Harvard for a year and like a semester, 2 semesters. That's a year. And I went to Houston, Texas in 1975, and I played rock and roll DJ in Houston, and the king, the icon, was Willie Nelson, right? Cosmic Cowboy. And it's hard to believe he's 89 today, Willie Nelson. But whenever I think of Willie, you got to think of Waylon. You think of Waylon and Willie together. You think of those blue eyes crying in the rain, and the ganja smoke. I know, Willie Nelson. Happy birthday, Willie. And you got to like all the Willies. I'm a Guillermo. That's the way the Filipinos say it. Guillermo, not Guillermo. So Willie Nelson's a Guillermo. He's a Willie. I'm a Willie. Happy birthday, Willie. I also want to mention how if you go to my ALDEF blog, aaldef.org/blog, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, aldef.org/blog, you'll see my column on Michelle Steele claiming racism against some comments that were made by the Democratic challenger, Jay Chen. This is in California 45. Funny name there, huh? California 45. It's almost like made for some kind of Trumpster to be, to hold court. Well, Michelle Steele is that Trumpster. She must be in a close race. She's got a Republican challenger, another Asian American, and she has Jay Chen, the Democrat. It's just May, or end of April going into May, and already the Republicans are pumping in $1.7 million. The Republican super PAC controlled or associated with Kevin McCarthy, the lying Republican minority leader, has put in reportedly $1.7 million in TV ads to showcase this Steele versus Chen. Oh, I'm Michelle Steele. I'm a victim of racism, which is absolutely false. But that's the false narrative that the Republicans want to use this year. I mean, we saw it yesterday. We talked about how they're going to do a xenophobic line in the Midwest, Michigan, Ohio, talking about undocumented voting, untrue. But that's the way that a white Christian nationalist party, the GOP, can consolidate or can figure out how to save what they have, what to preserve what they have. And it's sad that they're resorting to that because the grand old party ain't what it used to be. It's xenophobic, it's racist, and there may be some Asian faces like Michelle Steele, who is a Korean American who is married to a Republican operative, Sean Steele. But this is the way politics is played in 2022. Dirty, racist, and using the victimhood playbook to try to score points and get votes. It's wrong, and so we're going to call it out. She's attacking the Democratic opponent, Jay Chen, unfairly, who simply was not making fun of her accent. That's the basis of the false racist charge. All Jay Chen was doing was saying, I've listened to her. I don't know. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but essentially he wasn't making sense of what Michelle Steele was saying politically. It didn't politically make sense. What she was saying in public, what she was doing in Congress with her votes, what she was saying in public, what she was doing in private. So the best she can do is get $1.7 million from Kevin McCarthy. And now CA 45 down in Orange County is a hot button race because they're already spending money in the primary when Jay Chen's in his own Democratic primary, unopposed. It's going to be Chen versus Michelle Steele. And Michelle Steele, the Republicans are doing all they can to prop her up before the big general election in November. Pay attention to it. It's an Asian American race that has really national implications. They're pumping money into this one because they're trying to make it or keep it Republican. The real objectionable thing is they're using the racist victimhood claim. All right, one more thing before I go into the LA race riots, and then we'll bring up Daniel Phil Gonzalez, Professor Daniel Phil, who is a San Francisco State University professor. You'll also go to my columns at theinquirer.net, the Philippine Inquirer, because still talking a lot about what's going on in the Philippines and how it looks like Bongbong Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., could withhold any kind of possible last-minute search. A new poll came out earlier this week, puts him ahead by about 20, 25 points. It's going to take a surge of anti-Marcos sentiment. And it's only going to be because people remember what Marcos, the father, did in the 80s. Plunder the Philippine treasury, $10 billion. The family has given back some, not all. There's about $2.5 billion that's still in litigation. But even with that, the people in the Philippines are going on the Marcos name. And at least in the polls, the public opinion polls, they're backing Marcos. Is that going to last till May 9th, the actual election day? I hope not. Overseas voters, like those voters who are dual citizens in America, are already voting now. If you haven't gotten your ballot, go get your ballot. Call up the consulate, call up the embassy in Washington, get your ballot, and vote. This is a critical election, especially when you see where we are geopolitically in an age where it's the autocrats versus democracy. And if Bongbong Marcos gets to rehabilitate or gets to carry on in his father's legacy, his dictatorial legacy, I would say that's a vote for autocracy. It would be a shame if it happens given our current world crisis. But I have to say this. I've always been critical about how democracy has taken shape in the Philippines. This is just the way should democracy always look the way it does? Even American democracy isn't perfect. Am I being somewhat, is it being paternal toward the Philippines by saying you should have a democracy more like ours than like yours? Because your democracy it was intended to be like ours. And you're like making it Philippine democracy, which doesn't make sense. Well, at least we get to vote. And at least the people get to decide. May 9th is the vote. Like I said, if you're a dual citizen and you're listening to this or you know some who are dual citizens, U.S. and Philippines, remind them to get their ballots if they haven't. They have until May 9th to get their ballots in. All right. I want to mention the LA riots because this is the 30th year. It happened on April 29th, 1992, and it stretched to May 4th. It's called the LA riots and also the LA uprising and the race riots of Los Angeles, 1992. 30 years. It's been 30 years. And do we have a better handle on it? That's what I don't know. Some of you may recall it was the 1991 beating of Rodney King. You remember that. Rodney King, who described himself as being turned into a human piñata when he was being beaten by the LAPD. Went to trial, 1992. In March, the perps, police were acquitted, and that's what sparked off the broad situation. And then we go back to our news sources here. And then we had an incident in a Korean American liquor store. And that's where the Asian Americans got involved when Latasha Harlins was shot by a storekeeper of the liquor store. The riots engulfed the city. I think most people don't understand. I mean, I was in Washington, D.C. when this happened. 1992. I was hosting a talk show there at WRC. And I remember sitting across from my friend who was a journalist, Korean American journalist, Peter Hong, who did ultimately work at the LA Times. I think he worked at the Times. I don't think he was at the Times when I was talking to him in Washington. I think he was working for a magazine. But we talked about it from afar and looked at the pictures and couldn't believe what we were seeing. And I'm looking at, if you look at the Wikipedia page at the outcomes of the riot, 63 dead. If you would ask me, how many people do you think died in the LA? I don't think I would have said 63. I saw a lot of pictures of flames and fires. I thought I saw some looting. I saw some people out in the streets rioting. But I wouldn't have said 63 people died. I didn't realize that. And once again, the cause was 4 policemen acquitted of beating Rodney King. Also, the killing of Latasha Harlins in the liquor store incident. The number of arrests. Now, this I would have figured would have been high, but I didn't figure it would be 12,111. And the injuries, 2,383. So this is something worth talking about. I before I bring in Professor Dan, I want to go to Frank Xiong's column. He wrote a column in the LA Times recently. And he begins by talking about how it was 2017. He goes down into the intersection of Manchester and South Normandy, and we remember that intersection because that was one of the intersections you always saw some kind of picture of on TV at the time. 2017, that's when they were doing the 25th anniversary recollection of the riots. The Xiong talks about going to a local pastor, said, look, I'm a journalist. And the pastor, local pastor, said, yeah, I heard you, but what are you doing here? Aren't you scared? You people don't usually come down here. And the man was referring to the reporter, Frank Xiong, being an Asian American, although Xiong says that the pastor relaxed when he explained he wasn't Korean. So there was, even 25 years or even 5 years ago, 25 years after, still that sense of just a little apprehension where an Asian American reporter is suspected of being Korean and he's asked, what are you doing here? And so Xiong in his column talks about how the LA riots is the tale of two videotapes. That blurry camcorder recording of the King beating. I remember seeing that in 91 in Washington. I just couldn't believe it, right? This is happening in 1991. Well, it's happening in 2022, 2021. It's still happening. But there was something about the videotape just capturing it. And then there was this closed circuit footage of Latasha Harlins, her murder in black and white. Here's Xiong's column. Historians might argue about whether the LAPD and its chief at the time, Daryl Gates, were racist, but they have little ambiguity when it comes to liquor store owner Soon Ja-do, who accused Latasha, 15, of shoplifting and shot her in the back of the head. Latasha had put a bottle of juice in her backpack and had $2 in her hand. Because Korean Americans lacked representation in the mainstream media, Korean American shopkeepers became the victims and villains of the riots, racism's symbols and scapegoats. That's about as clear an explanation of what happened, where you had the Rodney King video, but then you had this Latasha Harlins closed circuit video. You had the liquor store owner on tape shooting Latasha Harlins, and there it was. You had the images, and now you had the victims and the villains. Back to Xiong's column, about 45% of all properties damaged were Korean-owned, according to the Korean American Grassroots Conference. Scores of Korean American shopkeepers were murdered, robbed, and beaten in the years before and after the riots, including 25 who were shot and killed between January 1990 and May of 1992, according to the Koreatown Emergency Relief Committee. A rash of depression and suicides left mental scars on the wider Korean American community that would last generations. And I'm seeing these really gory photos of young men, 18, killed, 3 other men injured, April 30th, 1992. As police are getting information, it's bloody, it's gory, and you should check it out on the LA Times website if you can, because it will let you know how serious this was 30 years ago. And yet, and the aftermath soon after. And now here we are 30 years later. And do we really have a sense? Have we really come together and rectified that past fully? Or are we now in this position where we have to see it in the news, talk about it in an anniversary kind of setting so that we can maybe begin to understand this Black Korean conflict? Back to Shuang's column. He calls this Black Korean conflict, described a very real nationwide dynamic between Korean shopkeepers and their largely Black customer base that was marked by violence, boycotts, and protests. Korean shopkeepers, terrified by violence and crime, did not treat their Black customers with the respect they deserved. Black communities, frustrated by not just their treatment, but by economic racism and disinvestment, organized boycotts of Korean-owned stores that would not hire Black people. But Black Korean conflict was also a term that confined the discussion of the riots, racial conflicts, to those two communities, players in a zero-sum game, as John H. Lee, then a reporter for the LA Times, described it. How that term that was being applied to those specific shooting incidents and how it extended to Koreans and Blacks as people, as a population, it did not make sense to me, Lee said. This past week, I had lunch with two reporters from the Korea Times, and we discussed the Black Korean conflict. Peter Pak was 32 when the King verdict came down. He was an on-camera reporter who went live from the First African Methodist Episcopal Church the day the violence broke out. He still feels persecuted by the narratives perpetuated around the Black Korean conflict. Why does mainstream media make a frame like that? What is the agenda? Pak asked Frank Xiong, the columnist, whose column I'm reading. It was a genuine question and one that I had trouble answering. Were the news media dominated by white perspectives and readers eager for stories about racial conflict in which white racism was not the villain? Were Korean Americans used as a convenient political tool for those who wanted to reject Black demands for racial justice? Whatever the motivation. Now those are interesting questions. Knowing that the audience is mostly white, were people, was the media eager to serve an audience that wanted to see conflict that was different from a Black-white, but a Black Korean perspective, and the whites weren't the villains? Or, as Xiong asks, were the Korean Americans used as a political tool for those who wanted to reject Black demands for justice? It seems like it could be an opportunity to say, oh, look, there they are, battling each other, those minorities again. Back to Xiong's column. Whatever the motivation, the timing of Latasha's killing was highly beneficial for the embattled LAPD. Judge Joyce Carlin's decision not to sentence Due to prison time was upheld just 1 week before the King verdict. History always reflects the worldview and aspirations of those who are writing it. Over the years, I've collected stories of the buildings that remained standing after the riots ended because Asians, Blacks, and Latinos were able to find common cause. A Chinese eatery on Virgil, a Cambodian jewelry shop in Long Beach, a Thai restaurant in Koreatown. In the story I wrote about the Cambodian-owned fried chicken chain in LA, I focus on the smiles, not the bulletproof glass. That I treasure those stories because Asian Americans were not the villains. This again is a column from Frank Xiong that he wrote in the LA Times. And it's a good one because it brings this perspective 30 years later about what was going on, what really was happening. I don't think anyone really quite understands. And then, of course, I'm drawn to the column because he quotes John H. Lee, who is a former LA Times reporter who I knew as a member of AAJA. And Sean talks about how John Lee left. He had an interview with a Korean shopkeeper who decided to stop keeping guns at his shop and cease selling hard liquor in an attempt to bond with his black customer base. And it was a great anecdote, but it was in the back of the story. And but it showed a kind of sensitivity that a non-white, an Asian American, a Korean American reporter could have to give a perspective in the media. And Sean points out that Lee quit the LA Times in 93, which I sort of knew because I used to see John at Asian American Journalists Association conventions. But he went back to Asian American media. And that's sort of what I did when I worked for Asian Week. I actually went in 95. John was working for the Asian American media a little earlier, 93. He wrote for Korean Journal, later Rafu Shimpo. He said, or he's quoted as, or paraphrased as saying, he felt a clearer sense of mission working for the ethnic media, which is why we do this, right? Why you'll find professional journalists who have had some mainstream success find that to get their voice, to get their perspective, they need to go to ethnic media. Lee's quote, "My goal has been to somehow dispel that notion that there is an intrinsic conflict between black and Korean people. The fact is, there is no intrinsic conflict between anyone, but the conflicts do form when narratives, more often false, get drummed up again from the same facts. Two people can look at the same facts, and one drums up a true narrative and one drums up a false one. The ethnic media tries to be a perspective that is more real, more authentic than the mainstream. But this is why we need more Asian American, more ethnic reporters, more diversity in the mainstream. And I tip my cap to Frank Sean for writing that column that points that out. This is one reason why we need Asian Americans and people of color writing for mainstream. And, you know, the LA Times has a great editor now, Kevin Merida, African American, came from the Washington Post, which LA Times right now, probably the best paper in California. And it is loaded with diversity and perspectives that you're not going to hear. So if you're interested more in the 30-year anniversary of the LA riots, I suggest you check out the LA Times. Let me bring in professor of Asian American Studies, College of Ethnic Studies, San Francisco State University, my good friend, Daniel Phil Gonzalez. Hey, Dan, how are you?
We're okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here. You remember 92.
I do quite well. And, colorfully described as you have done it, it's brought back even more, let's say, distinct memories, not
Yeah,
only of, you know, the, uh, the conflicts, but, there were lasting attempts to lessen the degree of conflict
yeah,
between the two communities, the Koreans and the African American communities. But what people don't understand is when they look at LA and they think that that's an isolated situation, but we had circumstances that uh, paralleled the Latasha Harlan's situation in New York
Yeah.
and Oakland.
Oh, yeah.
And they happened around the same time, within about at least a 3 year period. And so there was just like police killings of African Americans have been more frequently recognized, right, and featured in the news media. The same thing was happening in terms of the relationship between blacks and Koreans, and it was
Yeah.
a national issue. It wasn't.
Yeah.
It
Oh,
wasn't
yeah.
just a
Hey,
local issue.
look, I was in 1992, I was in Washington, D.C., and there's a strong Korean American community, a strong community that is in, these neighborhood small businesses. They run restaurants, they run stores, they run in New York. I think they were running vegetable stands,
Yes,
and
produce. Yeah,
and they were opening up their enterprises in primarily African American neighborhoods, and they were often, double glass windows, bars, and
sure.
it was, there was conflict. There was real conflict, and yeah, there were instances, and I remember from afar, 3,000 miles away, looking at the images of LA and not really understanding that there's real conflict. But once again, back to Frank Chong's column, there's
Hmm.
no, I mean, the conflict between black and Koreans is not a natural thing. There's no
Yeah,
reason for it to exist, really.
yeah, yeah. You have to. When I teach about this, I talk about it in institutional terms first. Why are the Koreans there? And one of the reasons is it's more expensive to set up shop in other areas, and so they could actually get into property and operate a business much more cheaply. But related to that is the fact that because it's in black neighborhoods, you couldn't get insurance.
Yeah.
You couldn't get loans. But the reality was Koreans financed a lot of their own businesses because they have an internal system
The K.
of,
Is it the
of
K
yes,
system?
yes, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. You're so well informed.
Well, they every group has some form of the K
Yeah,
system
exactly.
where they loan money to each other. They form family, essentially banks,
Right.
and they participate in the profits. But you need a highly formed sense of community and uh, you know
Trust. You need
trust,
trust. Yeah,
trust, and
yeah. You
investing
need
in
unity
each
and
other.
trust, and so and the process has to succeed traditionally. It has to have an overall tradition of success, right? A history
Right,
of
right,
success.
right,
And so people understand that they shouldn't violate that. I'm sure the violations occur. I'm sure that people who get the funding, misuse it in some way, or maybe even just take off, right?
right. Yeah.
Uh, but,
Well,
but
you own a store, you run the store, you make some profits. You don't like leave it. You're there,
right,
and
and
fortunately,
then as an institution, they employ family.
yeah, right,
So that's what keeps the business afloat, really, because their profit margin is very small.
right. It's yeah,
Most Korean owned businesses weren't making huge profits.
right.
Uh,
So the labor costs are low. It's family run.
exactly.
So you go
With
at
the
it.
Chinese,
Yeah,
similarly with the Palestinians, when they were getting started, uh, the Palestinians were notorious for opening up liquor stores,
yeah.
you
I
know,
remember.
marginal
There.
neighborhoods, and so what's the pattern's pretty obvious, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
a lot of new guys that happen to be people of color don't have the wherewithal to be able to open up businesses in so-called better locations, right? And so they go for what they can get. And as far as I've seen, the Palestinians and sometimes Sikhs succeeded in becoming at least tolerable members of the black community that surrounded them. They tried to develop positive relationships and all that. But then they moved on. Once once they succeeded in the liquor store business, they could sell it off and get into something else, get into another business that was maybe more profitable. A lot of them just got into real estate, the same pattern that the Chinese followed, right?
Right. Right. And then there's also the instances of the Patels, the hotel owners.
Right?
You know, they buy in a
Yeah,
hotel
Tenderloin.
in a lesser neighborhood, and in they are in the real estate business, and then suddenly,
That's
boom,
it. Yep.
the real estate in that area
Well,
suddenly gentrifies, and
yeah. Well,
they're millionaires.
the reason I'm laughing is that when I was clerking, when I was attending law school, I decided to clerk at a legal aid office in the south of Market, where, with no little irony, I was born in that area. And while I was in college, we would do community service work down there. And when I went to law school, it was a Hastings, which is in a Tenderloin location.
Right.
So it was easy to find places to do community service, right? Both north and south of Market. And the reason I'm laughing is that a lot of the issues that came up were landlord issues, and a lot of the defendants, or the people who I warned, could easily become defendants if I was unhappy with their treatment of my clients. were were Patels.
Oh yeah. Well,
Oh yeah,
that was a growing group and a growing Asian American group, and specialty in residence
yeah,
businesses, hotels,
yeah.
and they did well. All right, so getting
We
back
called
to
them flop houses. You remember that language? We
right.
called them
Oh, I
flop
do
houses.
remember that. But now getting back to the
Frank
Korean in
Buzard. Yeah,
LA.
yeah.
So, all right, so you teach by showing your students this institutional background, the way.
Then we get into the cultural conflict, because the kind of things that Black Americans expect in terms of indications of respect, right, and equality of stature, social status, right, was not something that Korean immigrants were very familiar with.
Right.
And there's no manual for how to be less conflictual in your relationships
Well,
with Black people,
well,
right?
wait a minute.
There should have been a manual.
Well, this is almost like a classist kind of thing, because in the corporate community, when white corporates deal with Asian corporates, they go through a whole thing about this is protocol, this is what's good, this is but if it works at the high corporate level, you have to imagine, well, it must work all throughout, up and down the class system.
it,
It
it,
just
it has the potential. Our problems, even with the way corporate
oh
systems
sure,
see culture, and
yeah,
it all comes down to who they hire.
yeah,
When China opened up because of the Nixon era, Nixon Kissinger era, and détente, right, with Russia, with the Soviet Union, with China. A lot of Chinese, American, and Chinese new immigrant students who were business majors, and the vast majority of time, at least at SF State,
yeah,
new Chinese immigrants were business majors. I mean, you could it was predictable,
yeah.
and so they were hired. A lot of them were because of their language skills. They were hired, bilingual and sometimes even trilingual.
Mm,
They were hired by American companies, big firms that wanted an in to China.
yeah,
Big firms like John Deere, Caterpillar, right? And they had offices in Hawaii because obviously it was closer to China, and then but the student, my former students who are now employees for these companies, thought, well, it only makes sense. I mean, I'm really looking at the potential for development and movement upstream, into management, because I clearly know the turf, I know the area, I know the culture, I know the language. But they get stalled in Hawaii.
why
And
is that?
they would talk to me when they were coming back here visiting family and stuff like that. And they asked me, "What do you think is going on?" And I said, "No, it's just basic corporate racism. They need you to be there as company and maybe window dressing, but they don't trust you.
All
They
right,
don't
that's
trust you.
at the high level. Now at the bottom end of the class level, not
Right.
from the high corporate level, but at just at the mom and pop store dealing with a 15-year-old kid, because that's really cultural misunderstanding.
It is
Natasha Harlan's puts a bottle
in her
uh,
backpack,
in her
and
back.
she seems to be intending to pay for it because she got money in her hand.
Yeah,
Okay, and I've watched that tape. I don't like watching it. Okay,
yeah.
but I'm every once in a while I wonder whether or not my memory, my visual memory, is accurate, and so I watch it, and then unfortunately I realize that it's all too accurate.
So,
Uh,
yeah, I mean,
and
there was
as soon as a black person comes in and they look like they're stealing something, the people behind the counter go rigid. And unfortunately, in this situation, this older woman had access to a gun, and
yeah,
so she's really acting not only out of loathing or hatred or anything like. She's acting out of fear. Okay, and it doesn't look like anything that she should have been fearful of.
right,
Right. So people don't understand that that reaction is also the result of their end of the experience. Okay.
yeah. So we have the shooting, and then it just gets compounded because it goes to trial, and the judge does not sentence this, you know,
Yeah.
the shooter,
Well,
who,
it's like the Vincent Chin case, right?
right, right,
Two guys. One of them is responsible for swinging the bat and killing Vincent Chin, and they don't get heavily prosecuted at all. First of all, the DA, sent an underling to go deal with the issue, and the judge said, the punishment doesn't only have to fit the crime; it has to fit the perpetrators, not the victim. But these guys are upstanding white gentlemen. Like, yeah, it was, and he was Jewish. He was a Jewish American judge, right? And
yeah.
so, where's his level of prejudice,
All
right?
right, so
So,
that's a chin case. But how about here in LA? I mean,
oh
uh,
yeah,
we, I mean,
in
it,
my okay,
I
I
mean,
just
we have the shopkeeper.
yes,
She's, she's, uh, she has pulled it. We see her on tape.
first
We have,
generation immigrant. She's
yeah,
she's she's scared. She is not loud.
yeah,
She looks like a victim,
yeah,
and that's how that gets translated. And once again, it's L.A. and the black community has had a really hard time in L.A. The I just covered this in class. I was looking at what was going on in the 80s and 90s in my Asian American class on American institutions, and it's really a cover for studying the legal, political, sociological, elements of our relationship to the rest of American society. So it covers a lot of law. It covers a lot of events like these that are indicative of our relationship with the rest of the society. And I paint LA cop culture as not really being very healthy and being very problematic. My 360 radar goes up whenever I'm driving around in LA. You know.
yeah. Well, do you think that the liquor store owner Soon Ja Do, let's name her, she wasn't given any prison time? Do you think she should have been given prison time?
I think she should have been sentenced, probably have the sentence suspended and in lieu of community service or something like that. If that could actually work. But I think a prison sentence. Oh, if I was to take the black point of view, of course she should have gotten a prison sentence because if it had been, if the shoes were on the other foot, on the other feet, I should pluralize that. Certainly, the Korean American community would have expected a prison sentence,
Yeah,
even if it was really a negligent shooting, or it was an excited, shooting that somebody did in panic and all the rest of that, right? So yes, I think she should have been punished in some way. I don't know that imprisonment would have either been necessary or just. But certainly, from a black community point of view, I think it would have been. Yeah.
Well, because of the judge's ruling on Dew's case, uh, that in conjunction with the Rodney King verdict,
Yep.
the four cops going free there was the anger was really palpable. I mean, you can understand how it all just kind of the confluence of that anger was right there.
Sure. And there's a long history, right? I mean, this goes all the way back to even before the so-called Watts riots of '65, right?
Yeah.
Um, so what most people think caused, if you want to look at it that way, the Watts riots was the Civil Rights Act. The signing of the Civil Rights Act raised expectations about the possibility of change for Black America. Improvement in their status and all the rest of that. Real programs, and there was some change. There were OJT programs. I think you're too young to remember those, but on the job training was part
Oh
of
yeah,
the
I remember.
EOA Act. That was
And neighborhood youth corps.
yeah, I'm calling you younger than me, man. So take it. Take it's
Yeah,
consistent with our obvious conflict in hair color, right?
yeah. I remember that. I remember those things. And look, all the race riots that were taking place, not just in Watts, but all throughout the country. I mean, it was
Mhm.
the the country was burning,
It was, yeah. and
and
and this was before Martin Luther King gets assassinated.
right,
Malcolm X, had gotten assassinated. John F. Kennedy had gotten assassinated, but the tension was there, and so when
yeah,
you raise people's level of expectation, and they go through this hot summer in L.A. and they're still jobless. The police are still beating people up in the streets. Uh, that frustration level continues to go up. I mean, there was a book by Nesvold, Fire Robbins, and Gurr. Believe it or not, they all had they all had very European, foreign sounding names. But the book was about anger and violence in an era of revolution, right? And they talked about frustration leading to anger, leading to violence. That the unholy trio, and that was exactly what was going on through for a number of communities right, inside the United States during that period. And so, while the African American community was getting a lot of news coverage, stuff was happening in the Mexican American communities. Obviously, things were happening that would lead to the formation of AIM, right? The very radical and militant
Amer- American
American
Indian movement.
movement. Yes,
Yeah,
and so it was happening everywhere. The Red Guard was formed in Chinatown, San Francisco, right? Of Chinese Americans
right.
that used to be, gang oriented bad boys. People who were politicized former members of the Huaqing, right? Chinese youth, which was the biggest gang that I can remember that
Yeah,
was ever
I remember
formed
hearing about the
in San
watching
Francisco.
growing up. Yeah.
Right,
Well,
right.
tell me. So there's a kind of militancy, and certainly
Yes,
the Koreans in L.A. They were armed.
yes.
They were
Well, they
armed.
you see once again when you have a country that has experienced warfare on a continuous basis, right? And there's continuous conflict going on between the North and the South. We don't hear about all of it over here, but if we have at least a couple of battalions every couple of years rotate from mainland U.S. into South Korea, okay, and you can easily find people who were part of that rotation and therefore were educated about Korea, okay, South Korea, and had experience there, and they were witness to the fact that there's all these little aggressions, these moments of aggression and border crossing that happen all the time between North and South Korea. We see the big stuff that the media likes to cover, right? But soldiers and sailors that are assigned to South Korea, Air Force, a lot of Air Force from Okinawa, right, they know what is happening on the ground.
Yeah.
Okay?
Well,
And so here we have this situation where uh, the majority of America sees these conflicts. They see the frequency of the conflicts, but they have no idea what the what it's like to be living with that on a day to day basis. So and they don't want to really hear it. I don't think most of America wants to hear how African Americans see this. So one, you said earlier, you got to go to the ethnic press
yeah, yeah.
to find out.
Look, Dan, that was one of the things about the Kerner Commission report, which studied why there was violence in America, um, in the black community in the '60s, and one of the recommendations was there weren't enough uh, African Americans in media, in the
Yeah,
news, and there
yeah.
weren't enough African American perspectives, and these people weren't being humanized in the news.
They were being constantly dehumanized.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
they
so not only do you have this representation mean that the people who do stories on them, if the African Americans are assigned to do those stories, right, the assumption is that they're going to be more sensitive and understanding and about how they tell the story. That though goes against the one of what conservative journalists like to say is the principle of objectivity,
yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, yes, you're right, and that's why there's still some conflict between uh, people of color who are journalists who say, I don't want to be stereotyped and do that story. I don't want to be
Right.
the person doing that story. Whereas there are other people like myself who see that story and see an opportunity to tell a different perspective of that story so that people that would benefit the wider general audience.
Yeah, you're interested in getting the story right, but you bring certain amount of sensibility, right? That others don't have. Okay, because their lived experience is not the parallel or congruent with the lived experience of the people that they're writing about. Now, I also need to warn that just because people hire Asians and Asian Americans, Asian immigrants, Asian Americans, into whatever their journalistic enterprise happens to be, doesn't mean that they're going to be representative.
Right.
Okay, they could be biased. It's much rarer, but if there are black Republicans who say things like the United States is not a racist country, then there's going to be journalists who happen to be black that aren't going to have the sensibilities that are consistent with reporting accurately in an unbiased manner about what appears to be their own community, right? The black
Right.
society.
Well, they'll stand up with a different perspective, just like in this Frank Strong column. He talks to John Lee and to Peter Pock, who was also there and remembers what happened. And it's that last line of the column. My goal has been to somehow dispel that notion that there is an intrinsic conflict between Black and Korean people,
Right.
and that should be like of people should just say, of course there isn't, of course there isn't, but
Well,
sometimes it what we when we see things like the Latasha Harlins thing come up, it almost begins because there seems to be this intrinsic conflict.
yeah, it's see, I had problems with that line, and it's because I understand what he's trying to say. He's trying to say that yes, there's racial difference, there's cultural difference, but it doesn't mean that there's a built-in or quote natural, right?
Okay.
Natural level of antagonism that exists between these two groups.
Yeah.
I agree with that. The,
Yeah.
the problem is what is the reaction to that from each of those communities. And I believe, okay, there were a number of my colleagues, a couple at Berkeley, who I'm fairly well acquainted with. I'm not going to say we're friends, but we
Okay.
know
All
each
right.
other.
You
And
know.
and they well,
Yeah.
like their colleagues. I'm really well aware of their work. I've read and worked with them and all that kind of stuff. When the Rodney King, I'm sorry, yeah, when the Rodney King situation happened, and when the reaction was the destruction of Korean businesses, right? They answered in a manner that got very close to validating the racism of Koreans towards blacks. It exists, okay? It exists. It's real. It exists. And so, if African Americans talk about Koreans, some, maybe even many Koreans, as being racist, they're not making that stuff up.
Yeah.
We
Well,
recently had a situation with the San Francisco Unified School District, right, with the board of directors that we had a purge, and three people were voted out of office. One of them, an African American, had said that Chinese were making use of their proximity to white privilege, right, their own kind of privilege, to block out um, matters that deal with social equity for blacks. In essence, she was calling them racist. Okay, well, the reality is there are Chinese who are racist. It's not all Chinese, but is there generally a racialized inferiorization of other people by many Chinese? Yeah, there sure as hell is.
so this is the thing, Dan, because I've also noticed this in my career as I write about Asian Americans and the Black Asian conflicts that I see it in Oakland, right?
Oh yeah,
I see it, and and y- I think you're not supposed to say so directly that, oh, there's racism. But I remember writing in the Oakland Tribune an op-ed in the '90s talking about how there's racism that exists. You've got to call it out. It's there.
yeah, it's there.
Yeah, it's not, but it's not just the Korean black, but it's also Chinese black, Filipino black. I mean, there's, you can point to all the, oh, look, here's an Asian black couple, or here, Filipino black couple. You can do that, but that's, an instance. But there is a lot of there's racism in our communities, and
And if you talk to the Filipino black couple and they answer you honestly, they're going to tell you that there's some level of rejection or discomfort at the very minimum on
right,
both sides of the family, right?
right, right.
So
It's so
that's
I
real.
guess so. The question is, how do we deal with this in a way so that we're not pointing fingers at each other, calling each other racist, but we're trying to deal with a real deep sense of a deep conflict that in some instances it goes beyond 30 years ago with the LA riots. It goes back to
Yeah, sure,
when the Filipinos first came, when the Chinese first came, when
sure.
uh, I mean, you can go back to the existence of Asian Americans throughout in
Well,
California.
the first step. I have friends that I've known since the strike, and some of them have been very dedicated to anti-racism. Okay, they've worked for it. They've developed hypotheses or theoretical frameworks that suggest ways that it can be effectively addressed. And the first element is you got to have people that are willing to recognize the problem, okay, if not for themselves as a thing within the society, and two, they have to say, in some ways, I've contributed to the problem. I'm a part of it. I'm a part of the conflict. I'm a part of the problem, and then be willing to do something about it. And then there's the question of the efficacy of the method, right? Is it really going to work? And so I think the equivalent of this is sort of stop Asian hate, right?
Yeah,
Sure, you're drawing attention to the issue. That's great. You're educating people about what it's like and what potential effects are, and you're suggesting ways that we can stop Asian hate. But how effective are they really? How willing are people to set aside those elements that support their hatred, loathing, their discomfort? You
well,
know.
one of the things you bring up is this idea that, all right, we need to talk about it.
Yep.
Just getting to that,
Yeah, you have to
level,
accept it to talk about it. Yeah,
yeah, just getting to that level is difficult.
yeah.
And then when you have, all right, you get my side talking, you get their side talking, you get both sides talking. Now you have to commit to that. There's going to be some kind of action. That
And there have been successful formations of positive relations, right? Not only between Koreans and blacks, but Chinese and blacks. Not so much with Filipinos and blacks. They're not that intent on it, right? But there's a lot of intermarriage.
yeah,
There's probably a higher level of intermarriage between Filipinos and blacks than with other Asian groups. Okay, blacks with other Asian groups. Um, I think there is a higher level of acceptance among Filipinos. Right. I don't know. It would be really interesting to see somebody who does their PhD dissertation on this stuff,
yeah,
and maybe it's out there and I just haven't noticed it. But
yeah. But
I'll look. Yeah.
it's true though that there's a high level of acceptance, but there's also at the same time concurrently there's a high level of distrust and racism.
Yes, there is, and
And
and and it's generational, right?
yeah,
The younger you go down the population curve, the less the level of conflict and what we could see as visibly racist behavior. Okay, well, when you go up the scale, you know, into 50 and older, especially into the age group that's now in their 80s and 90s,
yeah.
they're still alive. They're really racist. I mean, they're incredibly
It's
racist.
it's ironic though. Is it age or experience? Because those 80-year olds at
It's
some point,
experience. It's
yeah,
experience, and
but it's
they've had very little experience, but they see stuff in the news. They
well,
see
wait,
stuff.
well, what
They see
about
stuff that's in the media, the entertainment media, right?
yeah?
And neither of those treats black people very well.
Well, what about the older people who find themselves as 80 in their 80s, but when they were in their 20s, 60 years ago, they were hanging out in the Fillmore. They were, because that's where Filipinos generally and other
That was
Asians
one part
first
of the
hit.
city. Yes, yeah, there were
Yeah,
three parts of the city, right? The Fillmore, the South of Market, and the Bayview a little bit,
yeah, in
but
Hunters
yeah,
Point, the projects out there in Hunters Point. I mean,
that's yeah, yeah,
there were Filipinos and
Fifth
Asians,
Valley,
yeah, who were part of that, and so
We
now
lived.
they would,
My family lived in the projects inside the Crocker Amazon Park. We lived in those projects for a few years. With
yeah. I
from
just I know that that's sort of where I'm just saying that as younger people, those now older people who are among the more racist folks might have had
Well,
good
but see that, yeah,
experiences.
you just described a Filipino American experience. It was the
Oh,
people that are in the Fillmore, the South Market, Hunters Point, Bayview,
all right,
Viz
all
Valley.
right.
But what I was talking about are the post 1965 first generation immigrants, right?
You're
And
right. You're right. The
ever since the 1970s, there have 60, almost 70% of our community is first generation.
right.
you know
And
aren't we, us and our kids are the outliers.
yeah,
you know
and of course, this explains the Koreatown situation because
yep,
if you're looking at it as an Asian American, you say, well, we can get along, we're all Americans, but we have the explosion of population of
right,
immigrants coming, not just post 65, really more like post 80, post 2000.
that's right,
Suddenly here they are, and it's well in case of Koreatown, that's 92. So post 80, certainly, post
yeah,
80
yeah,
Koreans coming in, and it's in the language is a barrier, the culture is a barrier. They're Filipino or they're Korean Americans, but they are more Korean than American,
right, right.
and so there's conflict. And yeah, so that I guess that's the reason that
They've had some Koreans had interaction with Black Americans in South Korea because we have bases there.
right,
Okay,
right,
but those are the people who would run businesses and have frequent contacts with African Americans, and they were more likely pretty, what can I say? not only nonviolent but non-confrontational kinds of interactions.
Yeah.
Um, Now, the problem with the shopkeepers, immigrant first generation shopkeepers, is they didn't necessarily have those kinds of contacts with Black Americans in South Korea unless they were interacting with the military a lot, right? They had businesses near bases, near entertainment centers, that kind of thing.
So it's totally experiential,
Yes,
if
it is.
you
It's
come over,
heavily.
and so there needs to be a way that we can, create those better experiences here in
Yeah,
America once
I,
people come in.
I think we can do it. I think popular media is one way of doing that,
Yeah.
right? And but you don't see enough of black uh, Asian female relationships. You just don't see enough, right?
Suni Lee.
Sure.
Sunita Lee. She was showing off her relationship on Instagram a couple months ago, and it's an African American. I believe he's a football player,
Uh-huh.
college football player. But you know,
Uh,
I
well,
just think that there's, especially with rap culture,
Chrissy Teigen, and John Legend.
right? Oh yeah, Chrissy Teigen, John Legend. I mean, especially when you talk about the current American pop music and hip
Yeah.
hop culture, you see the potential
Oh yeah.
for creating those bridges, and so you have groups like BTS
Sure.
creating a kind of an intermingling between all the little pop, uh, uh, you know,
Yeah, they're really interesting. That's why people call it K-pop because it is an interesting mix, and then it has an originality, right? That's still not originality. You know what I mean?
they
It's
haven't
it's it's a
exactly ripped off the blues
they got a
and
blended thing going on, and but the fun part is there's enough people of all colors, all races, including African Americans, especially those that have been in the military,
yeah,
that love sushi.
yeah.
So 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 they're not only getting exposed and bringing business to the sushi joints. A lot of them owned and run by Koreans, right?
Yeah.
But they get K-pop on these huge screens in the restaurant, right? So they get exposed to all of that stuff, and their kids get into it. So that's cool. I mean,
So
there's a good relationship there, but it has to be. It can't just be imagery. It has to be the kind of discussion that you and I are having right now. You know.
so it would be better if you were black and I was Korean, or vice versa, and we can have this talk about
Yeah, but,
music,
once
culture.
once again, from an African American point of view, I'm not black enough, and from an Asian and white point of view, I'm kind of, why am I so black?
Yeah.
why do my musical tastes go in that direction, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
I know this is part of being, well, if once again you're an Asian American, I'm an Asian American born
exactly.
here,
Yep.
and we're an amalgam of all these influences in our American culture, which is diverse and broad, and we need to expose people as much as possible to this diversity so we don't
Yeah.
have, we don't have to have these explorations about if there's an intrinsic conflict between black and Korean or Asian and black.
Well, when we were making the comparison between a 70, 80, 90 year old immigrant and a 70, 80, 90 year old American born, or at least an American raised person, a 1.5
Yeah.
is what we're talking about. At 1.5 or second generation, um, the the reason we were interacting, and ironically, is because of racial segregation.
Right. We were segregated together.
Yes, exactly.
Well,
Or at least in adjacent communities, right? If not internal to the same community, we're at least adjacent communities, right? And it was more like that in LA.
yeah.
But
Well,
a lot of
yeah.
Japanese Americans, right, lived adjacent to and went to school with African Americans. And so the Japanese American taste in music went heavily towards jazz,
Yeah.
and R&B. And
Right.
so we got some great Japanese American musicians. Some of whom were first generation immigrant, right?
Yeah.
That,
Well, you know,
that put together big jazz bands and stuff, and they were really good.
was that in L.A. because that was the case in San
It,
Francisco.
we, yeah, well, it happened here too.
Yeah, with
Yeah,
the Korea with Japantown and the Fillmore right there,
that's right. That's
and
right.
and of course I was looking through some of the files that my dad had, and you know his residencies right there at
Right.
Japantown. He
Right.
lived, and
Sure.
as well as the South of Market,
Sure.
and then when he got married and had family, we moved to the Fillmore, and then to the Mission, and then once again to the Mission, and then ultimately out to the Richmond, which is
Sure.
suburban San Francisco, right?
Yeah, that was Irish, Jewish, and Russian.
Right, out in the avenues.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and you could tell how that the Irish was the heavy population because they had at least two funeral homes and about 20 bars.
right. The bars, the Irish love the
At
pubs. Yes,
least 20 bars, man.
I know about those bars there. So Dan, how do we look at to put a cap on the LA riots? Um, I mean, it's important to remember them 30 years later, right?
There is, and I think a lot of Asians may be learning about Latasha's case anew, and
Yeah.
and it appears to me that most people would think her death a tragedy. Okay,
Oh yeah.
um, I think most younger people would not try to justify, okay, what the shop owner did, and so there's an important opportunity there, to get people who feel that kind of empathy to take it a step further, right? And actually learn something about the black experience, and their reaction to relationships with Asians. There's a I don't know which Southeast Asian ethnicity they are, but there's a family that runs uh, a grocery store, around Leland Avenue, out in Viz Valley,
Mhm. Yeah.
just outside of Viz Valley projects, and Sunnydale is called, right?
Yeah.
Sunnydale Projects,
Oh
um,
yeah.
and they have a terrific relationship
Well,
with African American kids.
if you're in the community, you almost you have to you're serving them, if you're a store owner, or if you're a restaurant, or you're in the community. That's the big thing. And I always said that the way to thwart racism is if we all live together. And now we
Yeah,
kind of self-segregate, right? I mean,
right.
the the instinct is to move away. We had white flight
That's
and
it. That's
get out of
success.
the city.
That is success for Asian Americans, right? That's success. It's following the white flight,
Yeah.
essentially, right?
So we have a Asian flight, we have a brown
Yep.
flight. Well, I mean, all the families that grew up in the city that I know, Filipinos, well, you get a little successful, you move to a suburb. Some of them move to now. Some of these suburbs are first entry points for more recent immigrants, but to move out of the city to a Vallejo or Union City or Fremont or Daly
Right.
City, San Mateo,
Right.
out to San Francisco, that's kind of a step up because there's no way. Well, unless you are wildly successful, you're not going to live in Pacific Heights or someplace like that. But
That's right. I mean, the first step for the in the '50s was out to the Mission District, the Outer Mission, in the
oh
Excelsior District, and there
right,
was a little bit of that. Bernal Heights, the Excelsior District, a little bit into Bayview. Not that common, but there was a significant number of people who moved to Bayview, and then of course Daly City.
yeah,
Right?
yeah.
So that was huge, man. The movement out there was was huge. It changed almost overnight. I mean, particularly with the arrival of the post 65ers, right, in 67,
Yeah.
68, 69. By 1970, 71, Corpus Christi Parish and Epiphany Parish,
Oh, I
I would
remember.
say
Yeah.
they were like
Epip-
70%. Those
Well,
two churches, the 70% of the attendance was Filipino. 60,
and,
70%.
and the housing was very inexpensive. You could buy a
It was.
house. You could buy a house in that area for about maybe 120, 150,000.
Uh, are we talking about early 70s or when?
Uh, 70s, 80s, late
Okay.
70s,
Well,
80s.
yeah, yeah. 80s, it went up to around 100,000 and even higher. But in the
In the
'70s,
60s, yeah, it was cheaper.
oh yeah. So, well,
Yeah.
it started going up in the early '70s, but it's still maybe 35, 40,000
Yeah. It
like
was,
that.
yeah. They were
My parents bought their first house on Geneva Avenue, a half a block from Crocker Amazon Park. The corner of the park was Moscow
right.
and Geneva, and for $13,500 in 1955.
See, that's
You
the
know,
incredible
you
thing.
know,
The incredible thing, and that's the power of Filipinos who are able to take advantage of the GI Bill, and
yep,
had a
yep.
decent job and could save because everything was affordable, and now of course everything is just you know
Well,
ridiculous.
they only wanted, asking for 20% down was high at that time. You
Right?
could get in with a down payment of 10%, and for a GI, 5% was guaranteed. It was federally guaranteed.
Yeah. See,
Under the GI Bill. So yeah,
that was the power of World War II. The benefits to Asian Americans who were able to take advantage and go to war. You can prove your loyalty. You uh, get the GI Bill. You get
ten
a
percent
foothold.
credit towards a civil service exam.
Yeah, and you get a foothold in society, and that's part of the people nowadays are saying, "Oh, I'm an entrepreneur. Oh, I'm going to do tech. Yeah." Well, okay, now 2022 or
Right.
maybe post 2000, but in the 40s and 50s, we were still moving on up. We were
That's right.
still we were still pre Jefferson.
The GI Bill opened the door that had been closed by racial segregation
Yeah,
all the way up until after the Second World War.
yeah.
So
It,
that's really what happened.
it,
It was the biggest. I think it was the biggest single affirmative action project in the history of the United States. But just like Social Security was kept away from blacks, right? When it was, and a lot of regions and localities throughout the United States would not let black veterans participate in GI benefits.
Ah, yeah. See,
So,
I know
yeah,
that was one. Yeah, that was one of the problems, and now they're trying to rectify that with a bill in Congress. I think Warnock has sponsored it. He issued it um, the last Veterans Day. But yeah, it's Veterans Day last year, 2021. But it's interesting that how all these
Warnock or Walker, Warnock or Walker.
I'm not, yeah, I no Warnock.
Oh yeah, obviously, but God, the fact that they even could draft a guy like Herschel Walker,
Oh,
right? I
yeah.
mean, wasn't OJ wasn't available, huh?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, Herschel Walker, I don't know. He's a Trump favorite. Hey, but what you were just saying about housing.
Yes,
It sort of it goes back to what the Korean Americans had to do as they got
yes,
into society, and they didn't have World War II to rely on or the GI Bill. They
that's right.
came and they relied on that
They,
that
they
cult.
they also didn't have English language skills. That's one of the things that the Patels had,
Yeah,
because if you had any higher education at all, it like the Philippines, higher education was conducted in English.
yeah,
A
but
lot of South Koreans send their kids to the Philippines
yeah, but
for college education. Man, I hung out with some of those guys. Mostly because they treated us to dinner all the time. because they have rolls of money. I mean, these guys just they go to the bank once a week, right?
Well, how about this? I mean, was their language? Um, did the language skill issue was that also a problem too in LA? Do you think?
You mean between Koreans and sort of fitting in? Oh yeah,
Yeah, Com-
absolutely.
yeah. I mean, because the
Absolutely. That's one of
communication.
the reasons they open business. Because even if you had an engineering degree or something like that, if you didn't have good English skills, you weren't getting in. So
Yeah,
business was at least the first door opener, and that
yeah,
would give them time to learn how to speak English better and do all the rest of that stuff.
yeah.
Um, but then it becomes a 1.5 and second generation thing, right? They have more mobility because they have the language skills and less accent, right? If any at all.
Well, I just hope that people who are listening will be encouraged to read up more about the LA riots 30 years after. It happened in 20 or 9,
Yeah,
20.
hopefully, what they
Yeah,
can do. There are a lot of articles that look at that just say the Los Angeles riots, Los Angeles race riots, and so you can get you can get like three histories, right?
yeah,
And some of them talk about the L.A. riots against Chinese, right? And
oh,
the
yeah,
lynchings, and then
yeah.
they talk about the anti-Mexican,
Oh, yes.
Jutsu, riots, yeah.
You get all of them. You get
Caught
the situation.
Filipinos in between because they were brown and they wore jute suits. So,
Well, all right. As you mentioned that, though, this really shows this is not critical race theory. This is just American history.
yeah, just
And
because we're critical doesn't mean it's theoretical, right?
right. But it does show the difficulty
Oh yeah,
of, of our democracy.
it ain't easy.
Yeah,
It is not easy, and right now we're in an unfortunate position of internal polarization. Can I put it that way? People
yeah,
people take extreme positions on certain issues, and I'm talking about just within the individual,
yeah,
right? They're not just left a little bit on one issue and right a little bit on another issue and take kind of moderate positions with an understanding of the conflict between the two, the major points of conflict, right? It's not like that. They just have very polarized positions on the issue, and that's all you get. You get really, when you ask questions. Okay, so your community, a substantial portion of your community votes for Trump, and they would vote for Trump again if he were to run, get the nomination for 2024. Why is that? And they always cite things like family values, you know, and they
yeah,
cite things that are, abortion, right? Same sex marriage, right? And then the basics like taxes and immigration. Okay,
yeah.
and so these are people of color you're talking to, right? And two out of the five issues, right, from a Republican point of view, are dealt with from a racist core, right? But it's like they don't acknowledge that at all. They don't want to see that at all.
Well, they don't see it because they can't acknowledge or don't want to acknowledge that they are a white Christian nationalist. It's a white Christian nationalist situation now with the Republican Party. And so you look at whatever the Republican Party is, the agenda that is out there perpetrated by Trump and his followers. It's a white Christian nationalism perspective. So anti-abortion.
Right,
So anti-LGBTQ. Everything in this moral level that's really um, it's really a disgusting stance that they're taking, but that's the current GOP,
right, right.
and I don't know how we work our way through this, but we should at
Well,
least I don't know what.
we work our way through this by encouraging Democrats and independents to be very aggressive in their open arguments and contradictions of the Republican hypocrisies. And what State Senator McMorrow, her
Oh yeah,
her her
Michigan.
very wow, she was great. And I've been saying that to Linda, my wife, for years. I said the problem with the Democrats is they think all you got to do is show principle, truth, and people will come around. And that's been over for 30 years, and that's how come they keep losing unless the people on the Republican side are so bad that folks won't support them anymore, right?
Dan, you need more than truth, Dan.
Oh, you sure do. You need to beat them over the head with the truth. That's the problem. You can't just say it. You can't just give them a bunch of stats or put it on a graphic, right? With a chart, right? That's not working. That's not
That's
working.
the inflection point.
That's right.
Inflection.
That's right. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. You haven't. I haven't heard
It's
the
the
term.
data. The data.
Yeah, I haven't heard people mention inflection point more in politics than I
Yeah.
have in the last
Recently, yeah,
3 years.
It's a new
Someone
thing, man.
someone took physics and said, "Oh well, we need
I
to
know. I
include
like it when they say apogee. You know.
apogee." Oh yeah, oh yeah, the star.
It's cool. Yeah.
So,
Okay.
so, so Dan, all right.
Everybody went to college, man.
So we're moving on into what? Let me ask you one last thing about Twitter because that was the other big thing that people talked about.
Oh, some people don't think he's going to follow through.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah.
I
He's done that before, right? But not with $44 billion offer though.
if it affects Tesla, I think you might have something. But here's the thing: when you claim I am the public square and you take it simultaneously private,
Yeah,
uh,
that's kind of inconsistent, dude.
yeah, it doesn't make sense to have the private public square.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
yeah, that's just me. I mean, but they never mentioned that. I didn't realize. I should have. I just thought he was going to buy him. He would be a my majority stake or holder.
Yeah, yeah. I thought that might be okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he's a majority holder. He holds all the cards. But no, he was going to hold all the cards, not
he wasn't
just
even a majority holder. But if you take corporate law and you study corporations, you don't have to be a majority holder. All you have to do is have such a substantial right hold on the stocks that you influence everybody else. And believe it or not, with a 9 or 10% hold, he would still have great influence. You know, and
yeah.
they were going to offer him. They were talking about whether or not to offer him a position on the board. Remember that?
Yeah,
He
yeah.
didn't want to.
Well,
So
it's just in the reporting, no one mentioned he was taking it private. They were just saying
that's right. That's
it
right.
wasn't until like the second or third day that they said, "Oh, Musk is taking it private." All they did in the first day was say, "Oh, here's his statement on Twitter, public square, blah blah blah. We're going to fix the algorithms. We're going to make things more transparent."
He kept pushing First Amendment, free speech.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then the reporting started mentioning he's taking it private, and that's totally different. That's like taking Twitter and stuffing it down your pants. Um,
Oh, thanks for that image.
well, I mean, versus like buying Twitter and letting it
He's got that
flourish.
much room. He's got that much room in there, huh?
Well, he's
So exactly how well do you know Mr. Musk?
I just when he's taking it private, that's just oh well, okay, it's going to be his private part. So, all right, one last area.
I
I
thought,
want
yeah, yeah, we're gonna. Okay,
well, one last area. Lapu Lapu Day. We're gonna
okay, that's right.
It's not World Lapu Lapu Day. It's
Was
just
it
Lapu
was
Lapu
the
Day.
27th, right?
Right.
Supposedly the 27th.
April 27th, 1521. Lapu Lapu slays Magellan. And
Supposedly.
well, no, doesn't he slay Magellan?
Well,
Is that
you
one?
say. See, we want the. It's a romantic image that the guy that was the chief, right, of Mactan,
Right,
right, personally did the dude in. All right, because that's the way we like to see stuff.
right.
And
Okay.
frankly, that's imagery and more myth than proven. Okay,
But Magellan died.
he
After.
somewhere because they never produced his body. Remember that?
Oh, I don't remember that. I
Yeah,
don't.
they never produced his body. So one of the theories is that when he got cut down, he fell in the water, and there's some really deep water
Well,
around
it was a
around
coral
Mactan.
reef, right?
Yeah,
Coral.
yeah,
They couldn't get the boats through.
yeah.
In
Mactan is coral. It's a coral. You know,
yeah,
they had to stop people from mining. They call it mining, but it's actually cutting up the coral underneath the sand because it was depleting the island. Basically, you cut enough of that stuff up, the water's going to come in, and so they stopped it. But yeah, yeah, it's called Mactan tile, I think. There
yeah.
might be
Well,
another word for it, but it's
so so Dan, you're saying it's still maybe more myth that Magellan died on
Magellan
that.
definitely died. The question is whether or not one Lapu Lapu personally did the deed, or that Magellan just got killed by somebody, either Lapu Lapu or somebody under his command,
In the
right?
battle.
And then he fell in the freaking water, and they never were able to recover his body.
Yeah.
And that's believable because these guys were what would they do? They'd show up in armor, if not full armor, half armor, right? What's the problem with armor? Doesn't float very well.
Doesn't float, and it
It-
rusts. It rusts too.
yeah, they didn't have titanium and stainless steel at the time. That's right. They
So
could-
Magellan,
aluminum would work.
but
Yeah.
he died, and so here's the thing: he did not totally thwart or uh, what's his name? Lapu Lapu didn't totally thwart colonialism because
Yes,
40 years later, Legazpi
that's
comes.
another romantic thing about people citing Lapu Lapu as the first person to
Yeah.
resist,
Yeah.
to resist
Well,
European colonialism.
in a way, it is. He's
Yeah,
an
but
anti-colonial
did he
force.
know that, or was he just killing a stranger, man? I mean, did he have this concept, concept of globality? What I'm doing here is going to set those freaking Spaniards back a little bit.
Here is a foreigner. Look,
Yes, that's there. You go.
I'm going to take this metaphor and say, make it a personal Lapu Lapu day where you play your colonial mentality and the colonial forces that make you feel like you are either less than or want to come in and take away your sovereignty. So,
Sure,
in some ways, Volodymyr Zelensky
it's a
is 20,
parallel.
he's 2022 Lapu Lapu.
I have to admit, I like it.
You can be your own Lapu Lapu, and it doesn't matter if Magellan falls into the sea or
Yeah. Yeah,
is
I love it. I love it, but it's such a stretch that you should be the fifth member of the Fantastic Four. I mean, it's like,
wait a minute. Volodymyr Zelensky, have your own personal Lapu Lapu day during Lapu Lapu week where you slay your colonial mentality and become the person who you're supposed to be.
or you eat an oversized gourami in his in his name. I
Grubby, is that
don't
what they
think gourami. We can't get lapu lapu the fish over here, man. So I like to say, yeah, the dude was named after the fish. The fish was named first.
but the fish was named first and then the dude came?
It's a lie. I just
Oh,
do it to sort of terrorize the people
well, all right.
who
So
romanticize the hell out of Lapu
it's
Lapu.
Lapu Lapu first, then the fish. Now,
Yeah.
what about the Filipino leader Tilapia?
And well, yeah, it ain't. So what can I say, right?
Yeah, that's a good one.
You
Well,
know, there
I mean,
are a few Tagalog names that I would change if people knew what that meant.
yeah.
Uh,
All right. So Dan, I appreciate you being here as always. Um, are you out and about? Are you going out to like? Are you
I
masking?
have gone to one event. I didn't. Linda, of course, is still sheltering and trying to avoid crowds. At all. And I went to a small event that had a small crowd, and that was fine. It was a cultural event last Saturday, but and everybody seems to be fine. I haven't heard anything from that. But
Well,
a lot of people were practicing masking,
if
in
you
between.
mask, if you
Yeah,
mask and you test. Here's one thing. Um, my wife went to a dinner, or is going to a dinner, business wise, and she said, "Oh well." I said, she's. I said you can mask. And she said, "How do you mask when you eat?" Well, I said,
you don't.
"You can mask. You don't. Well, no, you don't eat. You can mask. You can sit there. People can talk. You can exchange and do business, but you just eat on the way to the dinner or eat after the dinner. You can
Okay.
mask throughout. I mean,
Now, I'm glad. I'm glad Linda didn't hear you say that because she would have required that of me, and
oh well, I
I,
just
I
think
would
that
rather just eat. I mean, you
well,
could you could keep your 6 feet away,
well,
right?
maybe, but see, when people say that, when people say, "Oh, well, how do you eat or drink with the mask?" Well, all right, you mask, you can conduct social, talk, but you don't have to eat then and there,
Right,
and
right.
then
No,
you
you can avoid it. Yeah.
you can eat in the kitchen with the help.
That's
That's where the Filipinos are. That's where I
what
feel most,
that's what I say.
I feel more
I've
comfortable
always
there.
been welcome. I've always been welcome in the kitchen.
Exactly. I always feel welcome there. So
Yeah, me
so
too.
anyway. All right.
Yeah.
Well, listen, Dan, I appreciate you coming on. Thank you very much, as always. And I'll talk to you later. But thank you for your perspective on the LA riots, Latasha Harlins. I know
Yeah.
what you mean. When I first saw the Latasha Harlins video in full, which was sometime after the initial event. I mean, I only saw it piecemeal in '92. I saw it later on. When you see it later on, and then you see it again, you say, how can this happen? How can
Yeah.
this happen without some major misunderstanding? And
Yeah.
so, all right,
Yeah.
Dan,
Anyway, thank you very much for having me once again.
yeah,
If it's
Professor Daniel Phil, we'll see you again. Hopefully next week, maybe
okay, it's cool.
Asian Pacific American Heritage Month.
We are
I
in the
mean,
to that month, so
we're itching, so we'll talk about that next week and all the problems that might come. Oh, Dan, you said something that I didn't follow up on. You said it was sort of like the looking at looking at this LA riots after 30 years. You said it's sort of similar to what we need to do with the Stop AAPI Hate.
right.
We
You draw
it's
attention to the issue, to the event, okay, and then you have to move beyond that. You have to come up with methods of acting in a
right.
manner that's consistent with with actually reducing the hate and actually you know aside from just drawing attention to it. It's the same problem all the way across the board, right? People do the demonstrations and then they feel good about having done the demonstration, and only few people actually work to address the problem directly. That's the problem.
And where do we address it? We address it. How do we get rid of that
Some of
distrust?
the
How do we get
stuff that worked, some of the stuff that worked in Oakland and in LA and in San Francisco was churches asked members of their respective constituencies, right, to members of their church who wants to volunteer to join, discussion groups on, the matter of this conflict, and so we can have a better understanding of it, and then also take steps to address it. And what they did was start holding events where people interacted. And it
yeah.
got to the point where the Asian business, because it wasn't just about Koreans, right? It got to the point where the Chinese and sometimes the Vietnamese businesses down in on the peninsula, or Santa Clara Valley, it can be Vietnamese versus Mexican, right,
Yeah.
rather than black, or Vietnamese versus Latino, Latinx,
Right.
um, and so that stuff works. Um,
Talking. Talking.
interacting and then trying to get people to uh, within their own families saying that hateful attitudes are can be harmful because the hate can lead to anger and violence and all that. And I think that stuff really works. On the
Yeah.
other end, you got to have penalties for the people who commit the harm, and that has to be well publicized so that the fact that people are going to get punished for this. What was the complaint that we had about continuous police violence? Up until very recently, nobody got, very few people ever got prosecuted, and nobody got convicted. Okay,
Right.
and the Rodney King situation, right? The beatings, not the riots. I think it's always sad that we have to call the riots after Rodney King. This, that's the worst way to remember him.
Yeah.
But I wanted to say one other thing about the way the police were treated. They got a change of venue. They were able to move the trial, out of L.A. proper, right, into a very conservative area, further towards the coast, around Ventura somewhere. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
Simi Valley, they moved it
Oh
out
yeah.
there. Yeah,
Simi Valley. Yeah.
yeah. So anyway,
So so
that
we need
kind
to
of
talk.
interaction really helps. Those kinds of interactions really help. It helps if you get it out to the schools
Yeah.
because of the tendency towards violence. I mean, look at the gun incidents lately. That
Yeah.
used to be a really rare thing, man. That a kid would bring a gun to school and then get caught with it, and
Yeah.
now it's so frequent, it's scary. You know.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well,
thank you again.
yeah,
Uh,
Dan, really, I appreciate it. We'll talk to you a little later. Appreciate seeing you again here on Emil Amok's Takeout. Daniel Phil Gonzalez. He is College of Ethnic Studies, Asian American Studies, San Francisco State University. Friend of the show. Always here to talk about all the things that are happening in the news. And today we talk about the 30th anniversary after the LA riots. 1992. Hard to believe, 1992. 30 years, that's a generation. And some people are still trying to get, some people were here and lived through it, are still trying to understand what happened and trying to make sense of it. And a new generation subsequent, right, who came to America or were born within the last 30 years are trying to say, as history, what is this about? And they don't get it now. They don't understand, but it happened. And as I said, I'm just astonished to see the stats. How many people? 63 people died because of the LA riots. There were like 12,000 arrests. There were 2,400 people injured. It was. It lasted from April 29th to May 4th, 30 years ago, and it's worth thinking about to see just how far we haven't come. So, anyway, I thank you for being here on this program. Daniel Phil Gonzalez, the professor, usually comes on Fridays. I like to have him on Friday because he adds a perspective, a historical perspective, especially on Lapu Lapu. That was a good one there, Lapu. So at this point in the show, regular viewers of the program know that this is where I talk about that loving self kindness. And when I talk about having your own personal Lapu Lapu day, I'm talking about slaying that Lapu Lapu, slaying the colonial image or the person who is colonizing you. And it's I think if you know that April 27th, if Lapu Lapu did it, that hey, maybe that'll give you some encouragement to do it on your own. And of course, I mean to do it metaphorically. I mean to do it in a way that frees you, allows you to be who you are. So, whenever you're feeling like, oh, I'm not me, I don't belong, I'm an imposter. Oh, you know that word. That word comes up a lot. Imposter syndrome. Oh, I'm not good enough. You are good enough. You are. You just are. That's just the way it is. And sometimes you just need to be held. So take this hand and put it here. Take this hand and put it here. And hold yourself. Hold yourself accountable for feeling good about yourself, for being the source of your own self-love. And so, as I wish for me, I wish for you. May you be safe. May you be healthy. May you be happy. And may you live with ease. We're heading into the weekend. Go back and listen to some of the old shows. Listen to this show. It's at on our YouTube channel, Emil Guillermo at YouTube, at Emil Amok on Twitter, amok.com, amok.com. We put the recordings. Check them out. Have yourselves a great weekend. See you next time. Until then, Mahal Gita.